Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session, where we will unveil the results from our latest research about the state of visual testing. To do the unveiling, we have two guest speakers with us, James Lamberti, CMO at Applitools, and Patrick McCartney, Director of Engineering at Applitools. So without any further ado, James, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Adi, and thanks, Patrick, for joining me today, and everyone, especially who's decided to take a little time out of their day. So we're going to keep this very interactive. And in terms of the agenda, moving to that slide, we've already done introductions, but just to emphasize that a little bit, I came to Applitools a few years ago, frankly, out of a passion for solving for the visual issues of the application as a marketer, right? As someone on the business side who cares deeply about how our brands and how our companies are now showing up in front of customers. I really looked for a way to resolve what we see every day as human beings, and certainly I see every day as a marketer, the visual issues that are now occurring in market all too regularly. And then to complement and really get into the technical aspects of how we can solve this problem is Patrick, who has spent better part of 15, 20 years in a variety of roles consulting with and actually deploying test automation frameworks and making sure to get the most out of those teams and those technologies. So we're going to go through, as Adi mentioned, the backdrop to this conversation is the 2019 State of Automated Visual Testing. There's a lot of really rich, important information and data we got by surveying over 400 companies around the world. And from the results of this, we found that there was a small subset, about 10% of these companies, that were really achieving very different results in terms of coverage, quality, visual quality, release velocity, and even the team dynamic and team morale. And the reasons they're doing it and how they're doing it are really why Patrick is here. So talking about those four things and giving you real examples. So as we kick into the session, I want to get our first poll underway here. If we can launch the first poll, Adi. Here it is. How many escaped visual bugs do you see per release? Okay. And again, this is where, to echo what Adi said, this is all anonymous, so you got to be honest. We know these applications are huge that you're managing and growing. We'll quantify that a little later on in this discussion. So really take this 30 seconds you got to answer this question honestly. And what Patrick is going to do is I hand the mic to him, so to speak, is talk about this trap that we are in that has essentially built up over the last 10 or 15 years when it comes to how we are dealing with test automation and specifically the visual quality. So we've closed out the poll. I'll share the results with you in a minute. Over to Patrick to talk about the untold trap of functional automation.
All right, thanks, James. Yeah, so guys, what I want to get into is how automation has sort of sold us short in certain ways, and then get into some real examples of where this happens and how we can avoid this in the future. So first, a couple of definitions we want to get through. Functional versus visual. So functional testing, I'm sure everyone is pretty familiar with it. This is just the idea of assessing if an application does what it's supposed to do functionally. So can I get from point A to point B? And typically this is, these are usually governed by things like functional requirements or user stories. So these are pretty set in stone. Everyone's familiar with this. Now, visual testing, on the other hand, this is assessing if the application actually looks the way it's supposed to look. Now, most people are using things like wireframes, design guides, mock-ups to do this assessment. And what we're going to look at is that in a lot of cases, this is done fairly manually. Now, let's talk about how the idea of past tests don't always equal quality. Now, when manual testers test an application, they're testing both the functionality and they're also testing visual aspects of the application, right? So a manual tester would find a defect that's functional, report it. Find a visual issue, they would report that as well. Now, when automation was sold to us, automation was sold as sort of that replacement for the manual effort. So, we can cut a whole bunch of time if we just automate these tests. Well, the little trap here was that we replaced a manual tester who was doing both functional testing and visual testing and replaced it with solutions that really just do functional testing. So what's happening is that we have functional automation suites that run, and the tests are green, the tests run successfully, but we're still having defects that escape. And these defects are primarily visual defects in nature. Now, this is happening to just about anybody you can think of. So a couple examples. This is happening to one of the biggest tech companies in the world, Amazon. This was on Prime Day. Now think about you try to go buy something on Amazon.com and the page doesn't really load correctly. Now functionally, the tests work. I'm able to functionally get through because I'm accessing the objects behind the scene, but to the user, it's practically unusable. The same things happen to Microsoft, another huge tech company, where in this particular viewport size, something's falling off the side of the screen. Now, this isn't a particularly egregious issue, but still, you can see that it is a visual bug. It also happens to people like UPS. So in this case, we were dealing with the viewport size. So I was on a tablet, and all of a sudden, I can't see where my nearest UPS store is. So what happens in this case? Well, instead of going to UPS, I may just go to the nearest FedEx store. So in this case, this might actually cause me to lose business. And Twitter, everyone's favorite social media platform. They only have 240 characters to deal with, something like that, 280 characters, and they still have issues. And this is a tech company at heart that doesn't have tech debt. They've got a new platform, so this still happens to them. So these issues are happening to pretty much any organization who's developing software. Now, let's get in and talk about sort of why this happens. The sad reality is that our automation tools just really aren't set up to find these visual issues. They're set up to do functional testing. And functional testing tends to be a pretty binary calculus. So like things either work or they don't. Obviously, there is some gray area where, hey, this is what it's actually doing. Is that okay? But, when you're testing against a set of requirements, they tend to be pretty black and white. Like the money either transferred or it didn't. I either logged in or I didn't, right? But when we get into assessing a UI, it's actually a lot more complicated. It's very, very subjective. So whether or not this is correct or not, whether or not that, this margin is the right size, whether or not, this type of bug is okay, or this bit of UI drift is okay, those things are really, really subjective. And what it turns into is sort of an art versus science conversation. So on the functional side, it's science, right? We know there's one right answer for the most part. 1 + 1 = 2. It's pretty easy to figure out if things are working or not. But when you get into the art side, this is what's really hard to calculate. It's not easy to test this. So, what's right, what's wrong? So in this case, we're looking at Starry Night. Look at all the stars. Like, are those the right number of stars? Are those the right size? Do you like this painting? Van Gogh likes it, but maybe you don't, right? And this is the problem that we run into when we get into visual testing and assessing visual quality, is that all of a sudden the decisions on is this visually correct, they get beyond the scope of a QA team. They get beyond the scope of a development team. Is this correct? Is this not? All of a sudden now we have to open this up to the rest of the business. So with that, I want to pass it back to James and talk about how these escape defects actually affect us.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So this is the first really good finding or data point we've got from this study, which you can, by the way, download. We'll make sure you can do that. But what we're looking at here is the frequency and the cost of escaped visual bugs per release. So this is from, again, over 400 companies around the world. And when you look at the typical company, right, the average company, and we'll get to the results, by the way, that you all, the poll you all did just a second ago, but you can see it's around 9 escape bugs, visually escaped bugs per release. Now, we were also told by those same companies it was about $4,000 per bug to fix it. So you're talking about $36,000 in hard costs, right? Lost money, opportunity costs per release. Now, you look at 30% of those companies, right? Really large companies or that have particularly complex applications, right? They saw 22 on average, right? With an average cost of $6,500. So if you go to the next slide, when you take these per release numbers And you start to think about this on a, do I release once per month, twice per month, 4 times per month? And of course, we know you're all under pressure to get to continuous. These costs become extremely significant to your business. So catching these issues early, it really has a material impact and value. So if we look at your poll results now, just to bring this all back to all of you, Dee, if you can show those. So yeah, I mean, this is, I can see here that, we're looking at probably around 50, 60% or in that 3 to 10 range. That's kind of in the range that we saw of 9. And then, yeah, you've got this subset of people that have more than 20, and there's a few of you who are very lucky, 20% of you. So it's interesting to see that your results kind of fell and largely in line with the way the rest of the market looks. So it's I think it's good validation. And now, just as a closing point before we move to the next point, and Adi, you can close out of the poll. I think we're seeing that you now have a way to quantify this in your own mind and even talk to the business teams around you or your manager around, hey, if I can catch these earlier, this is how much money and how much impact I'm having on the business. So starting to have that conversation using this data is really powerful. So I want to move to the next point in the conversation and really talk about and quantify digital transformation. So this is a buzzword. I know you've heard about this like crazy. We all have. And I would say that the notion, even the use of the word transformation isn't even accurate. I would probably change that to transformed. The reality is that our applications, our lives are digital, right? And these brands and these companies we represent and work for on a daily basis are almost 100% digital at this point in terms of the interactions we all have with them. So if we want to understand why we're getting so many visual escape bugs, we need to quantify the challenge ahead of us. We need to actually put numbers behind quote unquote digital transformation. So I'm going to actually have you take your second poll here and think about how many pages or screens you typically have on average for one of your applications, right? We know that digital transformation, the quantification of it for the companies and teams you work on, is a function of how many applications you have to manage, right? It's a function of how many pages or screens per application you see, and that's the poll we're having you do. It's a function of how many viewports you try to manage. It's a function of the browser and operating systems you want to support, right? And of course, it's also a function of how many human languages. See, that application goes from English to German or Spanish or whatever. So closing out of the poll, let's look at digital transformation and quantify it. Going to the next slide. Again, this is fascinating data, but when you really start to do all this math, this is the challenge that you all face. And frankly, it's insurmountable for a human being. When we even a small, relatively small technical company, software company that's just basically probably doing businesses with other businesses, you're talking about 24,000 screens or pages, some combination or variation that they have to manage every day. Like that's what's out there in front of your customers, even if you're a relatively small company. By the time you get to a large retailer or a healthcare company, you're talking 200,000-300,000 variations or screens you have to manage. The point here is that when we actually quantify this problem, which is, by the way, growing exponentially, it's impossible for a human being to actually manage this with the quality that we all want. So moving to the next slide, if we want to share the results from all of you, I think that'd be interesting. And here you can see, again, it's really confirmational. You're looking at the majority, close to the majority of you are in that 21 to 50 range. That's what we pretty much saw in market. It was somewhere between 30, 40, 50 pages. And there were a handful of companies, like the healthcare companies, that were well over 100. So it's really confirmational, I think, to see that you all view the market the same way that we saw it in the research. So we can close out that poll, Adi, and head into the next section of the conversation here, which is, okay, how do we deal with this, right? What are the effects of this problem? And with that, I'll hand it back to Patrick, who can talk about how we're managing this and dealing with it.
Okay, so digital transformation has really changed the way we're approaching some of these problems. And certainly the poll results show, you have lots of screens that you're trying to test. But the digital transformation actually makes that problem even more complex and creates a much bigger problem we have to solve, especially around visual issues. So we know that just the number of viewport sizes, screen resolutions, browsers, etc., have just sort of exploded on us, right? There's so many to test, and the biggest thing that we're seeing is that this creates visual defects. Now, the thing that happens in digital is that your application ends up being compared to every other application in market, even if you're not necessarily in the same vertical, right? So when I'm shopping for dog food, I'm comparing that experience to how easy was it to use compared to my banking app, right? So you're being compared across, every vertical just on how easy it is to use. And that's the consumerization of IT. And the more people that are using your application, the more people you have to support, and you have to make it work for everyone. And here's where the rubber meets the road, is that if the digital experience doesn't work for people, they sort of fall back to more expensive non-digital transactions. An example of that is, I need to move money from my savings account to my checking account. I'm, out on the road somewhere. I'm going to go buy something. I need to use my debit card to pay for something expensive. I'm going to move money, and the mobile app isn't working. Like, I can't do whatever it is I needed to do. So what am I going to do? I'm going to call the bank, or I'm going to try to go to a branch. Both of those transactions are actually expensive for that organization. So when those transactions don't work digitally, they fall back to more expensive transactions, if those even still exist. So if there even still is a branch to go to, or if I can get anyone on the line, on a Sunday when I'm trying to do this purchase. So these complexities have really made it really, really important to get this right. But the problem is that we haven't really updated the way that we're testing our applications to really work with this new digital landscape. And I want to talk about how we're testing applications versus how we're finding defects, because this is a pretty important point where visual defects come up. So the way that we test traditional applications is, we're going through step by step by step. Now, in this case, I've got 3 browsers. I'm just going through each step of my application one by one, checking to make sure everything works. So that's, testing 101, right? Now, the way that we think we find defects actually differs from the way that we're finding them in these new applications. So the way that we think we find defects is we go through the first step on each browser. Everything works. Go to the next step. Oh, okay, there's actually an error in Firefox. So we know Firefox has an issue. Okay, let's move on. Oh, now there's an issue in Safari. Okay, Chrome's still good. Let's move on. Looks like Chrome worked the whole way through, and there were issues in Firefox and Safari. That's the way that we think we're finding defects. In reality, though, we're not actually finding them that way. So the way that we're finding defects is like this. Step 1, everything works functionally, but there's a visual issue in Safari. Step 2, everything works functionally, but there's a visual issue in Firefox. Step 3, everything works functionally, but there's a visual issue in Chrome. Step 4, it breaks across the board, because broken is broken. If the web service is broken, the database is broken, web server, whatever it may be, the code is bad. The code is bad universally. And this is more and more true on cross-browser type applications, but even on mobile applications, the same becomes true. Broken is broken. We find very few functional defects that are specific to, one platform. Typically, those are visual issues. And so you can see how, doing functional testing broadly across all the different platforms we care about isn't really getting us the right type of coverage. And you can see then how, if you're not doing visual testing, how those visual defects start to escape. And what happens is actually, it's kind of a diminishing return situation. The more functional testing we try to do, the less valuable that functional testing becomes. Because the reality is we're just not finding that many cross-browser or cross-environment issues as we look even broader. And we mentioned before, but these traditional automation solutions are really bad at finding visual issues. In fact, they typically don't find them at all. And then the more you try to expand that coverage, the better chance you're actually going to fail for other reasons. So you you have too much test code, your tests become flaky, you're trying to support all these additional environments, you're trying to deal with all the extra test data. And so chances are those tests are going to start failing for other reasons. And we're still not finding those visual issues. So this is a huge problem. What we want to do is help you understand what are the things you can do to actually get out of this trap, to sort of bring yourself out and actually become one of those top performers. So with that, I'll pass it back to James. We're going to start talking about what the top 10% of teams are doing that are actually helping them with this digital transformation, with their digital delivery initiatives.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So this is where we get into kind of the 4 very specific or tactical things that we see. And again, when we looked at at this research we did, we saw that there was a subset, these 10%, that really had remarkably different results in terms of, and of course, it all started with coverage, which is exactly what Patrick was talking about just a second ago, and that continued through even velocity. So I'll tease out a little bit what you're going to see in the results, but these 10% of companies had dramatically higher coverage and dramatically higher or faster releases as well. And of course, all of this combined led to greater quality, right? So the first conversation we need to have is around coverage. It all starts with coverage. And when I want to take a minute to poll all of you on the next poll here, Adi, which is how much visual test coverage do you have today? So think about the conversation we've just been having. You've got these enormous, footprint, right, of pages and screens, and how much coverage do you really think you're able to achieve? And then what I'm going to do as we close out this poll in a second, I'm going to hand it back to Patrick, and he's going to talk through how it is that we achieve coverage, typically, at least over the last 10 or 15 years, and how these 10% of companies are attacking that problem very differently and seeing success as a result. So with that, I will hand it back to Patrick. We've closed out that poll. I'll show you the results in a few minutes.
Okay. So let's talk about how people are getting coverage. Now, we were looking at all the different form factors and screens, just the different combinations that you need to test, and there's tons of them. So in some cases, we were looking at hundreds of thousands. And so you look at just the percentage of coverage that you can reasonably get on that, and it's hard, right? There's just so many combinations. And we know now that most of the issues we're going to find as we dig deeper into that coverage matrix are visual issues. And because they're visual, we know these functional testing solutions are bad at finding them. So how do we get around that? So there's been a couple ways that organizations have tried to solve this problem in the past. The first is manual testing, right? Tried and true. This is the easiest one. It's great because you don't really have to be a coding expert to do it. And there's actually a pretty good chance you'll find defects, right? So if I'm looking at an application, as long as I know what I'm looking for and I have a general sense of the style and what it should look like, I'm probably going to find something, right? So the payback is pretty good. The problem, though, with these digital applications, you can't test 300,000 screens. It's just not reasonable, right? And then that's 300,000 screens times how many times am I updating this application? How many times am I releasing? It just doesn't scale. And the problem is that even as you start looking at all these different screens, there's still a chance that because we're human, we're going to miss things. Now, obviously, egregious things, like completely blown up layouts and things that don't make any sense, we're hopefully going to find those, right? But you look at enough screens and your eyes are going to go cross-eyed. So you're going to start missing things. There's a limit to how many things a human will be able to find. So this is not really a strategy that top 10% can use. So the next method people try to use is going through and using the functional testing solutions a little more creatively. So basically creating assertions in code. So if you look on the right-hand side, this is Selenium. Effectively what we're doing is we're saying, hey, let's make sure this element exists and let's test some properties of these elements. So in this case, I've gone through and tested 6 different elements in about 30 lines of code, probably 20 taking out spaces. The problem, though, is it's really, really code heavy, right? So again, I wrote 20 lines of code here to test 6 things. And are those 6 things even all the different things I want to test about those 6 different elements? Probably not. And the chances that this is going to break are actually pretty high. So if any of those locators change, which happens all the time with functional tests because we're changing the UI and the tests are not connected to the UI, all of a sudden my tests are broken. So every line of code is liability. So the more lines of code I have, the more liability I have that these tests are going to fail. And the problem is that I wrote 20 lines of code and I really didn't increase my coverage hardly at all. And so this solution doesn't really scale that way, right? And obviously there's less verbose ways of writing some of this, but still, you're not really getting that much extra coverage. And the clincher here is that it's not even really assessing what the UI looks like, right? This is how the browser sees it, but is this actually the way the user sees it? Not necessarily. I could be checking a URL of an image. That doesn't mean that the image is actually right. It just means it's the right URL. Maybe someone swapped it out. Could be giving me a different image, different version of it. So this solution doesn't work. Solution number 3, the last one we're going to talk about that doesn't really work. These are non-AI based comparison solutions. So we have things like CSS and attribute checking. Those are solutions like Galen. You get into open source image comparison using solutions like OpenCV, or doing DOM comparison, or even just straight pixel to pixel comparison. So the great thing is these solutions are cheap, right? A lot of them are open source, build it yourself, or commercial low cost solutions. But the problem is they're really high in maintenance, because as soon as something changes in your application, or as soon as the environment changes that you're testing in, or data changes, all of a sudden you've blown up your test. And now you have to retest everything, or you have to redesign those tests. And again, when you have so much change in your application, as these digital applications tend to have, and as the environments tend to change under them, you end up with too many false positives. So you just can't scale. So we see this time and time again with customers who try to solve this problem and then just fail because it just becomes too much. The burden of maintaining these solutions is actually not worth it. Like, they're just not finding enough issues to justify it. So how do we do it better? And how do the top 10% actually solve this problem? They're solving it with visual AI. And when I say visual AI, what I really mean is we're using artificial intelligence to help us find visual issues across every platform you care about. Now, the value here is that it's helping us eliminate the noise, right? So it's helping us find only things that are interesting. Now, we still need humans to decide, is this thing a good change or a bad change? But we're using the AI to make it, to sort of narrow our scope of vision, to make sure we're only looking at things that we need to. The great thing about this approach is that it's extremely low code. So we can write as little as one line of code and check an infinite number of things on the screen. So when you think about an organization that has a big digital problem, they have a huge number of screens, form factors, etc. Writing as little code as possible that needs to be updated, that's what they're going to do, right? They're going to gravitate towards those types of solutions. It's also going to give them a huge amount of coverage, because what you're effectively doing is looking at everything in the screen. A picture's worth 1,000 words. Think of all the different elements and all the different things about a UI: coloration, fonts, sizes, spacing, what pictures are there, etc. There's an infinite number of things practically that you could find in a single UI. And the great thing is that you can scale this across practically any number of screens, any number of browsers. And when you release, this is going to help you release way, way faster, because you can check all these things really quickly and hopefully find those defects before they hit production, which is the most expensive place to find them. So what we want to do is sort of show you where people are finding defects and sort of how people are actually doing this. So with that, I'll pass this back over to James.
Yeah, cool. So just to put some numbers and data behind this now, what we saw in this research we conducted, what you're looking at here is in the green bars, you're seeing teams and companies that basically said, hey, I've got a majority of my visual testing is automated, right, using visual AI. And then the orange are those that had low or no automated visual testing. And you can see no matter how we looked at it, whether, no matter how we tried to quantify coverage, you see a substantially higher, coverage footprint for companies that are actually leveraging this technology in the way Patrick described. So I want to jump to the live poll results. Adi, if you can bring those up to see what all of you said about coverage. And so, this foots pretty closely with the market overall. I mean, you've got, 65%, actually 85% of you are under that 50% mark, and 65% are under 25. So you can see how impactful visual AI can be. And I think it's real important, we can close out that poll result, real important to reiterate a point that Patrick made, which is often a misperception or misunderstanding. Visual AI is very scientific, right? It's obviously incredibly powerful technology, but what it's really doing is making you as a human being capable of looking at everything. It's eliminating all the rote aspects of that effort, right, with very little code. It does not have the art of a human being saying, I need to share this visual bug. I need to look at the underlying code and share that, which is part of the software. I need to route that properly through my team. I need to ask questions of people that may not be in R&D, but in design or in product or in marketing. So all of that effort to solve for the problem and the expertise around this is for humans, right? So I think that's a real important point I like to reiterate. And Patrick, let's move now to the next point here. So that was number one we saw. The second effort, of course, is faster releases. So, I mean, the struggle here is pretty considerable, right? You've got these applications which are getting bigger and bigger and bigger with more and more screens and pages. You're under more and more pressure to improve quality and have visual quality be frankly a competitive advantage for your company. At the same time, you also have to release a lot faster. So achieving those two things, it seems almost impossible. They're at odds with each other. Nonetheless, this subset of companies actually is releasing much faster, even though they have much greater coverage. So we're going to talk about how that's occurring next, and I'll hand it back to Patrick. Before I do that, to set up the conversation, I want to have you all take the next poll, because we can set this up nicely. How many times per month do you release, right? So think about how many times per month you release, and take a few seconds to fill that out. And as you're doing that, one of the techniques that people are frequently working on or thinking about is CI/CD, right? Obviously, if you can be releasing continuously and following those practices and building out that capability, that's what a lot of us are striving for. And if we close out the poll now, I want to share with you the reality from the research of how people are faring in market. We asked as part of the research, really, how many of you have a formal, true CI/CD initiative in place, right, in R&D, where you're trying to get to this continuous deployment state? And the reality is that over 40% of companies out there, of these 438 companies we surveyed, haven't even started this yet in earnest, right? People talk about it, but they haven't really started. And then what's even more, I think, alarming, but realistic from everything that we've experienced in talking to a lot of companies out there, is that for those 60% that have started, 23% are actually, not achieving what they set out to achieve. They're below expectations on their goals. So even though we've got CI/CD in place or initiatives in place to try to increase release velocity, we're really not started yet or failing. And that sets up the next conversation, is how do you get to the point where you can do this and still maintain quality? So I'm going to hand it back to Patrick now, who's going to talk about this behavior.
Yeah. So I think the important thing from this slide is you look at that 23% below expectations, and that's a pretty sizable chunk of the market that's really not getting the value that the industry is saying you should be getting. But the opportunity here for the 41% obviously is to not follow that same road of bad decisions or bad design that sort of led us there. So let's take a look at some of the pitfalls, and then sort of what you can do that actually avoids this, and what that 35% has been able to do. Now, what we see being one of the biggest detractors, or the biggest sort of points of failure in a CI/CD strategy is quality and testing. When you try to release software very fast, you try to have a completely sort of like touchless process to, commit code, build it, test it, release it. That process starts to break down when the software quality is bad, right? And anyone who's probably suffered through this would point to that as being, yep, that's what happened. Like, we weren't able to keep up the quality and things were breaking. And there's a lot of different things that can affect you there, even things like environmental issues or stability. But what we find to be the case is that when you try to run these tests at scale, things start to fail if the tests aren't written well, if they're not designed the right way, if you're not doing the right type of testing at the right places. And this is where this is actually why most of these organizations are failing. Now, one of the biggest contributors to this is code-heavy approaches. Like I said before, every line of code that's test code is a liability. And it's a liability because in most situations, that test code is completely disconnected from the application or test. Now, getting to things like unit testing, that's less true because you're actually tied in and you know when you're breaking your own code. But think of Selenium, think of Appium. If I change something in my application, there's nothing in the test that tells me the code is wrong and is now testing an old version of the application. It just fails, right? And so the more code heavy you go on these testing strategies, the better chance you're going to have tests that start to fail. And the problem is when tests fail, even for flaky reasons, they start to cause builds to fail. And so when a build fails, now all of a sudden the next process doesn't happen. That continuous deployment process doesn't happen. So this is a pretty big problem. And what ends up happening is that these organizations that that can't get this right end up just testing all these things manually. So I know we're talking a lot about visual quality, but this is sort of where it circles back into functional quality, that doing the wrong things by trying to get to that visual quality or even ignoring them completely actually will cause you to end up in the same place, because visual problems are often on par with functional issues. So let's talk about how that good chunk of organizations are actually releasing faster. And they're doing it, no surprise, with actually using visual automation. So the first rule here is, if you remember back to sort of the testing triangle, if you're in the testing space, you want to use as many unit tests and API tests as possible because these tests are reliable, right? They're fast. They give you a good sense of coverage very quickly, and so you want to use them. But you want to eliminate as many UI tests as possible. Now, you might think that's kind of funny coming from, James and I and Adi work for an organization that sells software to test UIs, right? So here we are telling you to eliminate as many of those tests as possible. Yeah, eliminate as many UI tests as possible. And the reason is those tests are the flakiest. Focus on the critical paths. And the thing you want to do is use the right tool for the job, right? So don't try to make Selenium do things that Selenium's not supposed to do. And that's what that 10% of these organizations have been able to do. They realize, look, let's stop using a screwdriver to hammer in a nail. Like, let's actually use the right tool. Now, that's part of this is using automated visual testing to look at the UI of each screen, each form factor, each language, across every release. And we want to do this as often as possible. Another thing that high-performing organizations have been able to do is use our visual grid to do that. So what visual grid is going to do is it's going to help us find issues across cross-browser scenarios extremely quickly, extremely reliably. So we're going to cut the time it takes to find issues by 90% in some cases. What these organizations are also doing is they're making sure that these testing events are tied to source code management events. So every time that somebody does a pull request, we have tests that are running. And the idea here is we want to find those defects as early as possible. And this is, we're not saying anything you probably haven't heard before, but the longer it takes you to find a defect, the more expensive it is. It doesn't matter if that's, a functional defect, a performance defect, a visual defect. Defects are defects. The further right you find them, the more expensive they are. So run your tests all the time. And if you find these defects early, they're much, much, much cheaper, right? Now, the goal here, though, is you want to eliminate manual effort. Like this is the whole key to it, is that those organizations that are able to do CI/CD successfully have figured out ways of reducing manual effort. You want to make that as seamless a process as possible. You think of all the different screens they have to test. Those organizations tend to have much more complex environments than the rest of us. They still figured out how to get rid of the manual effort. And the only way you can do that is by writing good tests, testing the right things, and using the right tools to do it. We're not saying more tools, more tests. We're saying the right tests, the right tools. Now, one of the ways they're doing it is by replacing lots and lots and lots of their code with a single line of Applitools code. What we're doing here is basically saying, look, if we can eliminate the majority of the code, we're reducing the risk, and we're increasing the ROI, because it only takes you a minute to write a line of code. And if you look at this example, check window, that's all we're asking you to do. A single check window line never needs to be updated. If your application changes, we actually give you ways of changing that without having to rewrite the code. So you're writing code that's effectively static, that's immune from your application changing for the most part. Now you get a lot of ROI out of it. The visual grid example is also one of these things that our customers that are in that top 10% have been able to leverage to go much, much, much faster, to release a lot more frequently. What this basically does is you run a Selenium test, either locally or in your cloud provider of choice. Doesn't matter which platform you run it in. Let's say you run it in Chrome. Doesn't matter which resolution you're running it in. What we're going to do is we're going to capture all those assets from your browser execution and then use those assets to re-render that in all the browsers and viewport sizes that you care about. So what we're going to do is basically say, look, you've already verified functionally the application works. As we were just talking about a couple minutes ago, you're not finding more functional defects as you increase coverage. So why look for functional defects? Let's look for visual defects. Let's look, let's fish where the fish are. If we're not finding defects in one place, let's go to where they actually are. So what we do is we re-render all those UIs for you and then use the visual AI to find those defects very, very quickly. So in the time it might take you to run, like you might run 30 tests in 10 minutes, we can do that in under a minute. And now you can start to see how if the tests are more reliable and they run faster and they're actually finding defects earlier, how I'm going to be able to release much, much faster. So I'm going to pass it back over to James. We're going to talk about how often people are releasing, and then we'll look at the poll results.
Yeah, and I think if we go to the next slide, you can see here there's a multiplier effect, right? Not only is the coverage increasing, but with the techniques that Patrick just outlined, you get a multiplier effect that you can see here with these companies although they only had 50% increase in coverage, their velocity is improving, close to between 2x and 3x, right? Almost daily. So there is a multiplier effect here when you actually put all these recommendations in play and stack them on top of each other. And what's even more interesting to us is when we looked at, if you go to the next slide, when we looked at the average size of these applications, they're more than twice the size on average. So you've got greater coverage, right? Between 2x and 3x faster velocity on an application that's twice as large. And really the upshot here is these companies, a lot of these companies that we're looking at in this 10% felt the pain. I mean, they really had to solve this problem, and they had to get very innovative about how they did it. And so a lot of these techniques, frankly, came from them, right? They came from these innovative companies having to forge a path here because the approach that was built up 10, 15 years ago, relying heavily on the functional frameworks, doesn't work, right? And so I think that's really interesting to see that we've essentially learned from those innovators, and we're now moving into where this can become much more mainstream. So looking at the poll results, how did all of you compare? So yeah, most, I'm sure the vast majority of you are Agile at this point, but not a lot of folks here that are, continuous or close to it. And that makes sense. I've seen data that around 8 to 10, single-digit % of the market is really getting to where they can release daily or truly continuously. And you're all being extremely honest on today's call, like being very, very forthright with where we're really at. So again, a lot of upside here for you if you follow some of the techniques that Patrick's recommending. So let's move into the final part here. And this is really about partnering with the business. So this a lot of passion around this for me in particular, right? And I think Patrick will do a lot to explain how it is that we've seen organizations change their process around how they deal with visual bugs. And this goes back to the art-science conversation. And when there's subjective interpretation involved, other people have to be involved. And how do you do that and still move very, very quickly and in an efficient way as a team? Now, we looked at, if you go to the next slide, we looked at this issue, and I want you all to take this poll now. Who has primary responsibility for visual quality, right? Who has primary responsibility for visual quality, and fill it out. And when we're talking about visual quality, generally the initiative that you all have heard about or maybe have it already internally is digital transformation. And you've got cross-functional teams, or like CI-CD, you've got some sort of strategic initiative to try to tackle digital transformation and manage all its implications that we've talked about today. So if we close out that poll, we see a similar situation for digital transformation initiatives. If you go to the next slide, that we saw for CI/CD, right? In earnest, a lot of companies haven't started yet. And if you're one of those companies, then in some ways you're lucky, because I think you're going to have learned and be able to observe and deploy some things that'll hopefully avoid the failures of those that went before you. But you still have 16% that are below expectations. So the question is, why? Like, why are these initiatives struggling, or why have they not even started yet? And I'll hand it back to Patrick, who will talk about this.
Yeah, thank you. So there's some interesting sort of dynamics when you start finding defects that are subjective. I'm sure everyone's probably dealt with some subjective defects in the past where, under certain situations, everything is, this thing is going to fail and this is a catastrophic failure. We have to delay the release. So all defects have some amount of subjectivity to them. But when you get into the visual side, this is the hard thing. The QA tester isn't necessarily going to be the authority on, is this the way the UI is supposed to look? It looks like this in the last release, and maybe it's not right. I don't know, right? And especially as organizations compete more and more for the same wallet share, they hire digital designers that test out every aspect of their design, and organizations pay millions upon millions of dollars to create designs and to make sure that it's the easiest to use. And so drifting from that is actually pretty consequential. Now, when you look at these organizations that have figured out how to really navigate this well, they have to solve for these 4 quadrants. Now, when we look at the severity of a bug on the x-axis and the different teams that get involved on the y, the first one is really severe visual bugs tend to also be functional bugs, which is actually kind of a cool thing because we can find functional bugs with visual testing. So if some web service is crashing and we see some error on the screen, we might detect that visually. We could potentially also get that functionally, but that one's pretty easy, right? So that one's sort of a no-brainer. Now, where it gets interesting is some more minor visual defects. So this might actually be something that the R&D team has to deal with, but maybe it's not. When you get into branding and design issues, now all of a sudden that might go to the business side. Hey, like, is it okay that we release with, the old version of our logo on this screen? Maybe, maybe not. Like, hey, is it okay that this screen resolution is not really working the right way, or this viewport size doesn't really work? I don't know. But then you get into more severe bugs and you get into things like compliance, legal issues. So, hey, we don't have this disclaimer on every screen. Is that okay? I don't know. And so these decisions quickly get above the testing team and the R&D team as to who needs to decide if this is going to get fixed or not, or what's the severity or what's the priority of fixing these things. Now, this is sort of the the hardest thing about incorporating visual testing is that, great, you found a bunch of issues, now what? This is what that top 10% has been able to figure out. How do we deal with these issues? Because this is effectively, when you get into digital transformation, you're creating applications to solve these big business problems, and everyone needs to be involved in sort of saying what's right and what's wrong. So let's look at some of the best practices that we've learned from our customers and from these top 10% that have sort of figured it out. The first no-brainer, they've used visual AI to drive their automated visual testing. So that's sort of the easy one, of course they have. The next thing, though, is that they've actually socialized visual testing, the concept and the technology, across all the different personas that are involved. So the business people, UI, UX, marketing, product, whoever needs to be involved is all using the same solution. And most importantly, they've created a collaborative process around basically voting or deciding whether or not these issues need to be fixed, right? It's really a triage process. Not every visual issue needs to be fixed. Not every functional issue needs to be fixed. But the problem is, in this art versus science conversation, there's more subjectivity to it. It's letting a QA tester decide whether or not to fix an issue isn't always the right thing to do. And that's the case for functional issues. But in visual, there's so much disparity between what I think is right versus what you might think is right, or what I think is acceptable versus what you think, or what the CMO thinks is acceptable versus what the UX team thinks is acceptable. The next thing that they've all done is they're all using a standardized bug tracking system. And again, when I say they're all, I mean everyone in the organization. So, the marketing team, the UI UX team, product team, everyone has access to the same set of tools. So it's this collaborative tooling process they've managed to put together. So they're using things like Slack or Microsoft Teams. They're using Jira or whatever your bug tracking solution of choice is, where they're collaborating. They're saying, hey, should we fix this? Yes or no? What's the priority? Is this good? Is this bad? But they're also, as we mentioned in the CI/CD section, they have full integration. So they're finding these things early, because these decisions get a lot easier to make, when you find it early. Bad news delivered early is always better than bad news delivered late. If it's the decision between delaying a release and fixing an issue, that's a big problem. But if it's between delaying a release, or if it's between fixing an issue that might delay a release like a couple of minutes or a day versus 2 weeks, well, not that big of a problem. So I'll pass it back to James to talk about sort of who has responsibility, and we'll look at the live poll results.
Yeah. So we're going to be wrapping up in a few minutes. I can't believe, there's several hundred of you who have stayed this entire time, so thank you. I hope Patrick and I have given you some things to think about. We are going to wrap here, just a couple more thoughts. This is important, right? So what you're seeing are the results of the study for the question that I asked you all a second ago. This is good and bad, right? It's good in that everybody really feels responsibility for quality. That's a good thing, right? I think you'd expect everyone to be involved in some sense, especially with visual quality. The bad thing is that when everybody owns it, nobody owns it, right? You've heard that expression before in the world of R&D and business. And so a lot of what Patrick just alluded to and recommended is you've got to step back and socialize and build a process. Otherwise, the benefits of a team-oriented approach to visual quality don't manifest, because it's unclear of how you route, how you make decisions, how you prioritize. And it's, in many ways, it's the same exercise that we undergo every day, all the time, for features itself, feature development itself. What are the most important? How do I rank them? How do I get to work on them? So moving to the poll results, and then we'll wrap up the conversation today and give you back your time. You can see here we had I think this is generally what we saw. You've got a heavy weight from this discussion and this group of people toward testing and QA, which is maybe why you showed up. Makes sense. But there's an awful lot of people who mentioned the front end team, the UI UX team, and even 11% going to product and marketing. The reality is that we saw in market, we saw probably a double that in product and marketing, and it's a little bit more spread. But again, the results kind of make sense intuitively. So let's move on to our last closing thought here, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about the fourth issue, which is leading the change. So one characteristic that every single one of these 10% companies shared was somebody on a team somewhere said, this makes sense. I know what to do. I know what the value is going to be, and I want to lead the charge. And when you look at visual quality team, and you think about final sign-off of the UI versus responsibility for work on the UI, this is where there's a real opportunity for an individual like many of you to lead this change. Because the reality is the responsibility lies within testing or R&D. And if you can bring to the business teams this solution and socialize in the way we talked about, your value and frankly, your future and career, I think, is more interesting, right? And, to close out and move to the next slide, the analogy I make here, or the elephant in the room, is the transition we made from cars to horses. There was this huge fear factor, right? Blacksmiths are not going to have jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is that an entire new industry and a new level of expertise was born, right? And it really holds true, right? And when we think about visual AI and how people fear, it's, oh my gosh, it's going to come take my job. This isn't robotics, right? Visual AI is basically taking a problem that cannot be solved by human beings and solving it. Specifically, it looks at every screen on every browser and every viewport of the application for you. It takes away all the rote aspects that inhibit you from covering this insurmountable task. And then it gets you in a position to add value, to see the bugs, to route them properly, to fix them, and to be that person on the team that's doing that. And there's a couple things I'll leave you with. One, if you go to the next slide, if you haven't heard of Test Automation U and you want to skill up in this area, there are 3 unbelievable courses, a couple of them by Angie Jones. One of them, I believe that's Amber Race. I can't quite see her photo there, but one is the Foundation for Successful Test Automation, a broad foundational view of things. There's a specific course on automated visual testing, test automation there. And then there's a whole team approach to continuous testing. So taking these courses through Test Automation U is unbelievably high quality content. The second thing I'll recommend and leave you with, going to the next slide, is all of this data I shared with you is worth reading. And the reason it's worth reading is because you as individuals, if you embark on this automated visual testing journey, for you to be able to understand and communicate your value back to the business team is huge, right? And this white paper, or this set of research, basically articulates your value, right? And I think that's a super important conversation with, frankly, people like myself who care deeply about what's happening to the visual quality. And we'll close out there with one final comment, which is, if you go to the next slide, yeah, here we go. So there's an opportunity here, right? I mean, the good news is that the innovators have already gone through and given all of us, including myself and Patrick, an understanding of how you succeed with this type of technology. And there's a big opportunity out there for the rest of us to follow their lead, and really get competitive advantage for ourselves and for our companies. So I'll close with that. We're 3 minutes over. And Patrick, any final thoughts from you? And thank you. This was really informative, and we're really lucky to have you on this call.
No, thank you. I think I'm okay.
All right. Well, Adi, I'll hand it back to you. I know we got hundreds of questions. We'll try to follow up, but I'll let you wrap up here.
Yeah, so 2 things before we wrap up. And James, if you want to take maybe one question just to, would you think that would be something we can do? Yeah, so just before.
Yeah, if you've got,
Yeah. So definitely. So before we go to that final question, I'm getting asked again, so I'll just mention that the recording will be emailed to you by end of day Friday. And second thing, I see a lot of people asking for a demo of visual AI. So obviously this Q&A isn't for that, and we don't have time. But if you do want a demo or understand more about it, just ping me in the question panel. I want a demo, and I will make sure that someone from Patrick's team we'll get back to you. Okay, so I'm leaving the questions panel open, so you can ping me, and we'll get people on that after the session. So I saw a lot of questions that were asking around that topic. So people are asking, okay, let's say I implement and deploy all the steps, all the technologies that you showed, that you described, and I follow that to the letter. Are those steps bulletproof against bugs, or can I still fail?
That's a great question,
James,
Patrick. Do you want?
Yeah, I can take that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, look, there's always a chance of failure, right? And I think what these organizations that we were detailing, that top 10%, have been able to do is really get behind this from a strategy perspective. The biggest reason that people fail is not software. You look at all the failed initiatives, most of them are not software or not technology related. It's people, right? And so getting on the same page and having a clear leadership direction that this is what we want to do, and making sure that everyone is aligned, that's the most important thing. You obviously can still fail, but that's probably the biggest takeaway, is that without that sort of unified direction, all marching to the same beat, there's a much better chance that you're going to fail, because there's all sorts of reasons why any of these projects can fail, because of different personas, etc. So that's what I would say, is that leadership, making sure you're on the same page.
Yeah, I think the other thing we've observed is there's a misperception, and that misperception is largely, oh my God, another tool, or I've got to rip and replace my entire functional framework. And that's absolutely, positively, simply not the case, right? The getting this into play is not a rip and replace. It is not a wholesale change, right, in what you're doing. It is, it slots in and augments your existing stack seamlessly, right? And it can be done with an individual or an individual team seamlessly, who can show the value very clearly. So the objection of that we hear, the failure here is really that the failure to start because of a misperception about how heavy this is technically, or how much debt you might build up, or ripping and replacing your stack, et cetera, et cetera. None of that's true. And I think Patrick's team does a really good job of explaining that. But that's another pitfall I would avoid. So with that, we will say thank you again, and thanks for hanging on 7 minutes over the hour. Adi.
Yeah, so unfortunately, that's more than the time that we had allocated for today. I want to thank everyone that joined us for this live session, and of course, thank James and Patrick for their time and for this insightful session, and for all of you for participating in the polls. Very much appreciated. I'm just going to remind you once again that the link to the recording of the session will be emailed to you by end of day Friday. If you want a demo, the questions panel is still open, so you can request a visual AI demo, and I'll make sure that happens. And thank you. I hope to see you all at our next event. Bye.